Good afternoon, and welcome to Numeracy Coach's very first AP Stats Deep Dive. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Santhra Thambidurai, and I've been tutoring math for over 20 years, middle school math to AP statistics and college level statistics, inclusive of my time working at one of the nation's finest school districts. And it's been the joy of my life to help hundreds of students gain confidence in math, and also help them achieve strong outcomes, particularly exceptional outcomes in AP Stats. And I'm really happy to be here to share those insights with you, along with my mentor, Ms. Biro. So today's webinar is designed to help you as students better understand what you will experience in AP Stats, what makes the grading very precise, and how students can avoid common pitfalls. We'll spend about 30 minutes going over the format and the precise grading, and about 5 minutes to go over any of the questions that some of the attendees had asked us. Okay. By the end, hopefully, as students, you'll know what success in AP Stats looks like and what kinds of support can make a meaningful difference along the way. I am so thrilled to be joined today by my mentor and fellow numeracy coach, Miss Monica Biro. Biro has developed the AP Stats curriculum at Westminster Plainsboro High School North, which is a top 2% school in the US. And she's had decades of experience guiding students to success in this course. And critically, she's also had extensive experience as an AP Stats grader. So she understands the rubric better than anyone else. And so super, super excited to have her here to share those exact strategies that help students move from confusion to a score of 5. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm excited to share, my knowledge and share some insights for you all. It could be a tough exam, but definitely conquerable. Just learning some techniques and strengthening your skills in general as a student. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Super excited to get started. Before we dive in, a quick reminder, we value your time as a thank you for attending the live session. We're raffling away 3 prizes at the end, an hour of free AP Stats tutoring and 2 of our favorite AP Stats prep books. So, and we are going to use a live attendee, so please stay tuned and stick around. And the winners will be announced after the webinar via email. So let's start with the big question. I'm going to just have both of us here pinned. Give me a second. I should have pinned myself earlier too. Here. Oh, I want to get both of us in here. Pin. Yeah, I got it. Okay. So let's start with the big question. Why is it that AP Stats, which is so often said to be, a super easy A, actually is one of the lowest scoring exams nationally? Historically, AP Stats has often had a, let me share this with you here. Historically, AP Stats has had a lower pass rate than AP Calc BC. You can see that it's pretty much like hovering above 75%. And stats and Calc AB are just like, trying to fight it out for the lowest scoring AP exam here. And it just goes back and forth. But this past year in 2025, AP Stats did have the lowest STEM passing score among all the STEM exams. So the BC rate, obviously, you can kind of see it's one of the reasons could be because students who are taking the BC exam already have a solid foundation in math, and they're typically more motivated. So that could bring up that rate higher up. But we're really focused on the stats exam and what makes that, hard. And so, Biro, what do you think? Why is it that kids sometimes who have strong conceptual understanding We've often seen these students score less than a 5 on the exam, even though their foundation is really solid. What are some of the issues that you see often?
Yeah, so just like you said, a typical AP Stat student is probably a strong math student. And what I've noticed over the years is just the connection with the other disciplines, with the writing component, with getting
Mm,
it to be more of a worldly kind of subject or topic where we're just not focusing on can you get to an answer. We
right.
want to build also your skills as you develop as a student and then as a get into your careers and jobs of how you can take math and really relate to everything else you're doing. And that's, I think, where I see students struggle is really that just just kind of finishing the whole big picture rather than just the answer is really just a small component of it. So that's where I've seen a lot of the struggles. And I think when I talked about earlier about being conquerable, that's one of the main things that I believe is where we don't see as successful as one might hope or would think they would have on the exam.
Right. So it seems like you're saying that students have to be really precise in their wordings and in what the College Board is expecting them to say. But of course, that ties into, writing a comprehensive response, just like, and it's going to support them in their careers in the future. So what I would love to do is, Ms. Biro, why don't we first talk about the free response section? Because I feel like that's the one that really gets those strong students, right? So we'll just kind of go over this. Can you explain the FRQ format real quick, if you don't mind?
Sure. Yeah. So the exam itself is 3 hours, and we'll talk about the multiple choice later, but you will have an hour and a half to do 6 FRQs, and that's always the second half of the test. Um, the first 5 are typically, focusing a little more, honing in on things like collecting data or exploring data, probability and sampling distributions, which many of you, if you're an AP Stat, you're starting to hit those chapters. And then the second half of the year, we focus on inference. So you might see a question or two on that. And then that's your typical 5 questions, a little more skills in there. And then we have what we call our investigative task. That's our question 6, which they suggest around 25 to 30 minutes. So you get all 6 questions at once, but that question 6 is really where you see where each part really develops into each other, and they might give you a new distribution you've never seen before, but they'll tell you, hey, let's use something from this prior, and it's all about applying. And we've talked about in my classroom that probably the things you're going to learn in college are going to start being outdated by the time you hit your jobs and careers. So how can you pull from the different tools that and just kind of extend it? And that's really what we're looking for. They're looking for in that question is be able to, something you might not be used to, your non-routine ways and whatnot. And then,
Right.
so the first 5 questions, they suggest around 10 to 12 minutes. Obviously, one question you might take 5, another one 15, but that investigative task, we really want you to think more and try to apply more, something that might be out of typical, straightforward kind of stat
Question
math
that you
question.
see.
Yeah. And
Right.
then each part is scored basically, depending on the question, depending on the parts there are. In part A, you get between an E, P, or I, E being essentially correct, and essentially is just that. You may make a silly calculator error or mathematical error as long as you understand in general what's happening, and and then as long as you're applying it later. Partial, and we could talk about that a little later, what that means. You're missing a key idea there or an incomplete, and then your problem is based on those 3 letters, and that's how your score comes about, which we'll show you later.
Right. So we kind of talked about the this being one of the biggest mistakes is precision in languages, which we're talking about. Like you got to be really precise and the context. So I want to go over those things. And you can, like Miss Bureau said, each question, like the first one of the questions, you're definitely going to have one question on collecting data, one on exploring data. So this is typically your chapter 1. This is where most students are right now. So those are really important chapters. And then the next question is probability and Salmon distributions, which is I think, what do you think? It's two or three chapters together, right? Like it's probability, random variables, and Salmon distributions, all of that. This is inference, and then these two guys are can be from anywhere. So why don't we, since we don't have a lot of time, but what I was thinking, maybe I can, if you can perhaps give some tangible pointers on, let's say, exploring data, like the chapter one, some things that you emphasize in your classroom.
Sure. And most of you might have heard of CSOCs. And I think it's important that, with exploring data that the number one thing you should always be thinking of is context. That should always be in part A, no matter what. You always want to put value, meaning behind anything we're doing. So context is so important. And then, and then just going through each of those in the acronym. What's really important is that I personally, and this is how I teach my classes, is that this is in a math elective, but use numbers. If you're going to be talking about centers and spread, yes, it's important to use key vocabulary. And my students will hear me say a lot that a lot of times anybody who's, you may not have taken AP Stat could answer a question. We're looking for more than just being able to answer the question. We want you to use statistical vocabulary. We want you to use numbers. We want you to use comparison, things like that, depending on the problem. But really defining like what are the different shapes we talk about? What does a center mean based off the shape and things like that? So it's taking it up a step. So CSOC is a great acronym for that one, when to describe a distribution, and especially if you're asked to compare, use comparative words, give numbers. We always love to talk about the differences, talk about the similarities. So just, so for exploring data, everyone thinks it's just as easy just to kind of throw some comparisons out, but we want to really hone in on numbers and context. It's huge.
Sorry, I had to kind of unshare and reshare, but awesome. So CSOCs, and then when you're doing comparing distributions, make sure you use comparative words. That's what you said, correct?
Yes, and give numbers, right? Like
And give
instead of just being
numbers.
like, oh, their medians are the same. I always say to my students, well, what's the next follow-up question someone's going to ask you? They'd be like, what is it? So, if and you're going to hear me say this a lot too, but if you're concise in what you do for every problem and it just becomes natural, as you progress through your statistical course, or again, your other classes too, I feel like this can definitely go to, and then your jobs and careers, if you kind of are always thorough, using the language of what you're talking about, covering the whole basis, but keeping it simple too. I think that's the hardest thing too. How less is more. How do I keep it simple? I tell my students, look at what topic you're in. We have very definitive language, so use that language. I tell them I don't need to see a 10-page paper because anybody can write a 10-page paper. So what makes you taking the course stand out different from someone that doesn't? So
Right.
using that language is really huge.
Right. And if you are not able to take full notes, don't worry. Like we will send a guide with all this, and I'll have all this put together there. So don't worry about that. But why don't we talk about collecting data, Ms. Biro? Like what do you see? And this is the topic that most kids are either taking or taking right now, right? So what are some of the things that you see with collecting data?
So this specific chapter has basically no math in it. And
I
I
know.
think, that's the one topic that I see a lot of my very numerically high up the math students struggle more with. But again, going back
Yeah.
to what I said earlier, it's read the prompts, answer the question that they're asking. I find that people talk too much instead of just thinking to yourself, what is the language we're using? Like answer it based off of what you've learned. And then justifying to me is the biggest one. Students might say, like, oh, it makes sense that we should be separating by different class levels, freshmen, sophomore, junior, seniors, and talking about the sampling process, but then you never connect back to why is that important? Oh, different ages have different needs, or the maturity level. So justifying is a really big one, because I think we all know, like, if someone wants to convince you of something, they need to justify it to you. So it's the same thing here. And that's what, when we say conquering this course, that's the extra component I see that students who may not be an AP Stat miss. Or, if you're not as successful right now in your course, think to yourself, am I justifying? And I think that's really important. Same thing when you're discussing biases. It's easy to state one of the biases, like I said, know the language, but again, giving that justification of why it's important, we were saying how most of you probably are in experiment design, but we were talking about what's cluster sample versus stratified, and with cluster, if you're taking all sophomores as a group and asking them, why is that not representative? So just make sure come full circle, connect back to the original question. And again, that's, why, what I really.
So when they're asking for a bias, and you said, definitely state the bias and also justify. And they also need to talk about, typically, I mean, are they typically going to ask you, is it an overestimate or underestimate, or they just have to just say it, like without, even though they're just say identify the bias, do they have to say that in their response?
Yeah, and luckily now what I'm noticing is that usually they might say to you, hey, this is the type of bias. Does it underestimate or overestimate, and why? So sometimes they kind of guide you along, but sometimes they don't. And yes, and the underestimating and overestimating is really important in the connecting back to it. Yeah, connecting back to it and really, understanding why is there a difference and whatnot in there. So
Right. Awesome. And then, I was thinking maybe we'll quickly talk about inferences. The kids are not going to be, they're taking inferential statistics until January, but we'll kind of quickly talk about that. Do you want to kind of go over some of these pointers?
sure. Yeah. So again, the connecting right back to the problem, it's easy to mathematically. Now, some of you might not know what a p-value is. If you've already done the normal distribution, it's a probability. And your significance level, again, going back to that, you could write a 10-page paper. You could write a 10-page paper or talk yourself blue in the face to somebody, but we always connect. Like in probability, there's a straight up formula for independence. There's or mutually exclusive. Same thing with inferential. We will have a mathematical comparison. So it's important you're connecting your calculation to what we're considering, whether you're significant or not, and being able to state that it's a significance level. I find students might just compare their probability to a number and they're not stating it's their significance level. So it's connecting where math is being able to be used to be able to, make decisions on things that may have not happened yet. Or, I always say in that topic, when we get to inferential statistics, your businesses, they need to keep moving along. And how can we be better than the next business? If you're just kind of sitting pretty and doing what you want, what you've been doing, you might be losing out on opportunities that other companies are going to be losing out. So when we do inferential, these businesses are trying to look at how do we get ahead. So they have to be, trust in their sampling process and data and be able to make decisions. So we want to make sure it's very exact. And that's where the math part comes in, which is great. But then being able to make your conclusion based off of that. And that's where language comes into play and the justification comes into play. And that's where the first half of the year, we're really trying to push that. And that's where I go to saying, if you're consistent every single time in what you do, every time you're using context, you're making sure to show formulas, you're always justifying, you're always connecting back, that doesn't change in anything we do. So I continue.
Right. I think these we can maybe go over on a, we were just talking about it. Maybe we'll do another webinar to talk about inferences, because there's a lot more to talk about with that. But why don't we talk about context, Biro? How important is context when you're answering any question?
I mean, it's huge. And, I just, not to bring this up for the seniors, but, it's November 1st and a lot of college applications were due. And, when I wrote my recommendations, I kind of, this is how I kind of try to explain to my students why context is important. Someone could write a very generic, oh, they work hard in my class, they do this, they do that. But if I can connect it back to you and use context in how you personally are, made a difference, it just makes the delivery so much more important, so much more impactful. So context is really important. I always try to say when you're reading your answer, anybody, they don't have to be a stat student, anybody should be able to read your answer. Maybe they can't follow the formula because they don't know the formula, but able to read your answer and know what that question was. And so that's where context really plays a big role in, just being thorough.
Right. And we wanted to kind of go over this question, but I don't, we're almost at 20 minutes, but maybe what we can do, this is AP 2025 number 2. So students who are present, I would highly recommend you to do this question. Um, shall, shall we, maybe we'll just quickly read through and go over this, right? So you can read this question by yourself. Farmer wants to reduce the number of aphids in a cabbage field. River is located 100 meters south of the cabbage field. He divides it into 25 regions of equal size. And then the farmer would like to estimate the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are affected by aphids and believe that the extent of aphid damage is greater for the regions in the cabbage field closer to the region. To obtain the estimate, the farmer is considering 3 sampling methods. I'm not going to go over all of it just because we don't have the time, but let's just look at sampling method 1. So sampling method 1 is select region 3, which is this region. It's closest to the farmer's house and farthest from the river, and examine every cabbage plant in the region for aphid damage. So question A was explain whether sampling 1 is an appropriate sampling method for the farmer to use to estimate the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are damaged by aphids. So Biro, I know you recently gave this question to your students. Can you tell us some of the things that, that they said or they missed, that, people who are watching can take as tangible pointers?
Yeah, and I also scored it for the AP exam. So it was like,
You did.
yeah, it wasn't my primary question, but it did take a little bit longer. And I really believe it was the context that is what made it a
Yeah.
little bit longer. So again, keep it simple. You don't need to write a lot. But the biggest thing we wanted to focus on is the context part, because prior to this question, we were all used to saying, oh, as long as we said farmer or F
Something,
or
yeah.
region, anything that
It's
was
fine.
context, it was taken. But now, the AP stat exam has been developing more into this writing and analysis kind of course. And so students, as you can see in component 3, for just part A, they wanted 2 of the following minimum. And so a lot of people were surprised at that. But if you go back to the original prompts,
I know. So
um,
this is 1 second, Vera. So basically, like this is kind of um, it comes down to essentially saying stat and parameter and the sampling and sample and population. But I love, can you go ahead, tell us, Vera. I love your way of explaining this to the students.
yeah, I mean, in your writing courses, I'm sure you would learn, like, whatever the question is, you kind of start with it. So if you look, it says, explain whether sampling 1 is an appropriate sampling method for the farmer to use. And now what's he trying to use it for? To estimate the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are damaged by aphids. If you just rewrote that statement, you got both components right away. So part A is always so important too, because context, to me, preliminary always comes in part A, because that's the original start of the question. But just going back to your writing styles, if you just rewrote it, now we're talking about what are we trying to do? And as you get to inferential, I did talk to some of my students. I said, you probably missed the proportion part because we're not even there in inferential. And when you get to inferential, we're comparing proportions or means. You would have gotten it on the AP exam, I'm sure. But the idea is, what are you trying to do? We're trying to estimate a portion of cabbage plants, and where in the field. I had students write on the farm in my class or things like that. And I said, don't use words that are not in the problem. Like
Right.
the question says in the field. So say in the field. And that's, I think, important in life. I think we're too used to being like, oh, you know what I meant. Or, we think some words, correlate with others, that we can use them, doesn't matter which word you use, but it does matter which word you use. And it really is important as you get more precise in your jobs and careers. So my suggestion is just rewrite the prompt and you're done.
I
The
love that.
context part is done.
That's
So
so easy. I love
yeah.
that. I love that explanation. Awesome. So that's the context. And we really wanted to go over this one too, but I don't think we have the time. But just to kind of, we had talked because some students don't even see the, it really depends on the teacher. No, some students don't even see the AP rubric, or I've tutored kids who even, more than halfway through the year, they haven't actually scored an AP exam. So, or scored an AP question by themselves, right? So this is what we were talking about. Each part is scored as essentially correct, and then partially correct and incorrect, and based off of how many essentially corrects or oh, can you see this, Biro? Can you still
Yes.
see it? Okay.
Yes.
So based off of the number of essentially corrects or the partially corrects or the makeup of the incorrects, you're going to get a score from 1 through 4. Now, Biro, have you ever had any questions that you were like, this is exactly 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how you're going to score it, right? But have you had any questions where when you were scoring it and you would get like a 2.5?
Yeah, so this part has only three parts, so that it would that you get three letters, and that's why it works out nicely. That the arrangements of the different letters work out to these scores, and then sometimes there's a four-part question, so you're getting an E, P, or I for one of those four. So an E would be 1 point, and P would be a half a point. So it's
Mm-hmm.
possible with four parts you can end up with a 3.5 or a 2.5. And I did score 2 years. I scored a question like that, and I'll be honest with you, those halves, because you have to get an integer score on the AP. So going back early when I was explaining the FRQ component part of it, each one is scored out of 4. And then questions 1 through 5 are worth a certain amount of points, and question 6 worth a little bit more. So based off of that. But if you end up with like a 2.5 or 3.5, we have to give you an integer answer. So it is very hard to get rounded up. We don't round you up. We look in your paper, and usually we look in specific spots. Now, if there was the main part of the question, we'll go like if it was such a huge statistical part of it, we'll go back there. And if you really said damaging statistical language or totally use the wrong formula, will score you down. I did score a question where it was scatter plots, and I'm not sure how many students have done scatter plots yet, because I know I wait till later, till inferential to do it. But we talk about strong or moderate, and so we had dinged them if they used the wrong one. But if that was the only error, then we were like, all right, they can go up, which means really the only way your half went up is if you got a 4. Because we decide like what really is considered strong or moderate, because there is no necessarily definitive line.
There's no, yeah.
Yeah, so for the most part, then some people argue, well, then why don't you just turn it into a 3-part question? Because we don't, because it is possible to go up. But I think it's important to go back to, you get a formula packet. If again, like I was saying earlier, if you know what topic the question is coming from, just focus on what language is that, where is it on the formula packet if it's numerical, and stick to that. And if you could stick to that, you're more likely to go up then, because then we know what you're doing, just somewhere you missed it. But yeah, for the most part, it's hard to be rounded up, and those are the tough questions to score as well, to be honest with you, because we really do look out for our students. We want the best score for our students, but we have to make sure that we, on paper, there's none of this, oh, you know what I meant, or I knew what they meant kind of thing. And so that's really what I focus on in my classroom, is getting what's up here down on your
Clarity.
yeah, clarity, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like we went back to about the the precision of the language.
Right, right, right. So, we wanted to do more, but we really don't have a lot of time. So we'll just jump right into the MCQ part of the test, which is the remaining half of the exam score. There's 40 questions, and this is digital. The free response questions, you'll see the questions on your laptop, but you're going to answer everything on paper. And there's 40 questions, and you have 90 minutes for that. So, what are some of the things that you see with the MCQ portion, Bureau?
Yeah, so my advice is I would treat anything mathematical versus completely a verbal question differently. If it's a straight up mathematical question, whether it's probability or whether it's a normal distribution question, I would just do the question without reading the answers. Just because, do what you know and then look for your answer. That's my advice when it's mathematical. Read the question, do the problem, then read the choices. Whereas if it's more of like a reading kind of question, and you have those answers are based off of what you're reading, if it's experiment design, if they're talking about randomized block versus completely randomized or paired or whatnot, use your highlighter feature. Any kind of vocab you see, even in the mathematical part, I would be highlighting or write down on your scrap paper. That way, when you start reading the choices, things will pop out at you, which is definitely wrong. Reading some people like to read all the choices before they read the question. I think in a very wordy kind of question with a very wordy kind of solutions, I think you get too much in your head. There's too much going on in your brain. I would read the prompt and then read all the choices. Yeah. So if it's a very wordy kind of question, highlight, write stuff down that then start reading all the choices. And please read all the choices. Don't just hit yours that you think is right. Sometimes that happens. People might need to read a part A and then oops, they missed it. It was all the above. Or even if you think your answer is B, then you read part C and you're like, oh wait, it's using that language. Oh, right, this one is the stronger answer. So you just really want to be careful of that. Obviously, process of elimination is great. For anything that's mathematical that and we could always talk about that if we do another session here. You always have Desmos available to you. Definitely throw stuff in there. And I've always encouraged my students, let's say they're asking about standard deviation and you don't know which one would be bigger, throw it in Desmos. Just put like 5 data points in there. Yeah, and just run stuff. Just manage your time. 90 minutes. Typically, most students say the 40 questions are 100% doable. They're not really worried about that. But again, if you read a question and it sounds confusing or you don't even know where to go with it, highlight, write down. I'm telling you right now, the language is very precise in the topic. So you'll start, it'll hit you what to use. So.
Oh, manage. This is why I'm an AP stats teacher. Yeah. Manage time. Okay, awesome. That's great. We have all that stuff here. Mathematical question. There's so many insights, Biro. Great. So I feel we're at 32 minutes. So we'll wrap up the main part of the presentation. But why don't we talk about answer some of the questions that some students who registered actually gave to us to ask. So one of the question was, what is the best predictor for AP score? Is it getting A's and B's in classroom material or something else to focus on? So why don't I start answering this, and I would love for you to add on to it, Vera. So I personally feel that your grades do have a correlation to your scores, but not a strong correlation because it can really depend on how well versed the teacher is, right, in the AP grading and how precise and how they're making sure that the kids know the expectations. So a student might end up getting an A in the school year, but if the teacher has not really laid out all the expectations that they need to adhere to in order to get a 5, because as we saw, the grading is so precise and the language they need to use is so precise, they're not going to get a 5, right? So I feel like it really depends on the teacher you have, how strongly the correlation is. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think just because you're getting an A or B doesn't mean you're going to get a 4 or 5. My personal belief is within the first month or 6 weeks, I can typically feel out what students are going to get. And to be honest with you, my students that may not have the strongest math backgrounds or maybe are not in an honors math class, they can hands down get 5s if they're just taking the advice that we're giving them, talking about connecting, justifying, things like that. I've had a lot of success with regular track students who got used to being in honors math class before, but they know what they can handle. They put the time in and they listen to the feedback. And they It's,
Right.
that's like probably my happiest time is when I go see the scores or they write to me and tell me. And I'm like, you put the work in, you were willing to make the change and get outside of your comfort
Right.
zone,
Right.
what you're not used to.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, and how to study for the AP exam? I feel like we've kind of already talked about this. You know, especially I feel that students need to have exposure to AP questions from the beginning. I don't know how what your experience with tutoring has been, Biro, but I've seen so many students from even, top 5% schools, not necessarily West Windsor, but other schools who have not seen like an AP question and like they don't know how to score it. They don't know even what the format is. So, but kids really need to have that exposure from the beginning so they get into the mindset of, okay, I need to have like in order to get an E, I need to get this, and this, right? So anything to add on to that, Bureau?
I mean, almost every single kid that I have tutored in AP Stat, I would say almost all of them. I can't even think of one kid actually that had none of them had their teacher hadn't given them the formula packet. And that kind of surprised me because I think that's
Yeah,
important in life too. When you get your jobs, careers, business, they're gonna be like, here's the model we use. How are we gonna extend it?
right.
And I think that's important too in being able to, especially when you get to the AP exam, you get everything. You're not in an experiment design section. So I think that's important too, is understanding what you get and how you can use it. That's a
Yeah,
test taking skill in general. So, but yeah, so I think that's another big one that I noticed. And I 100% agree. Teachers have given the AP questions, but they don't go over with them, or they only show them, oh, this is what they were hoping you would say. And then you don't scroll down later and see as how it's actually scored and what we were looking for. And I think that's where the connections happen.
yeah,
I also tell my
yeah.
students, I love when they get twos or threes out of four on the APs I'm working on doing with them right now, because I can work with that. We can
Right.
work
There's,
together to get your score up to a four. So that's where the learning is happening. And
yes.
yeah,
I love that. Mistakes are, important because only then you learn, right? Like, I love that. I don't really think we have the time to go over question three because that's really like, an actual content thing. So we're not going to take that one. And then why don't we, so we'll talk about the raffle. We do have 1 free hour of tutoring with an expert and 2 AP prep books. I do know who joined. So I will we will do the raffle and then we'll keep in touch via email after the webinar as I announce the winners. And finally, so last, of course, Biro, thank you so much for being here and helping out and giving all your insights. And hope students who are present can take those, and directly apply that in the classes, in the course. And of course, if you need any additional support, feel free to reach out to us via our website, numeracycoach.com, and schedule a call. We do have limited spots open for AP Stats tutoring, and it includes a lot of stuff here. You can read that. But really, really happy to have, for you to giving us your time, Bureau, and allowing us to create this opportunity for students to gain your insights free, and which is a great resource. So thank you so much for being here, Bureau, and thank you so much for all the attendees. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the evening, and good luck with AP Stats.
thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.